I came home late that evening, tired and craving nothing more than to kick off my boots and settle into the recliner with a cold beer. The smell of laundry detergent hit me as soon as I stepped inside. Helen must have been doing laundry again. She had this weird thing about the house being spotless even though it was just the two of us. The sound of the dryer hummed faintly in the background as I walked into the living room. It wasn't until I went to throw my work jacket into the laundry basket by the door that I noticed it. Sitting right on top of the pile of clothes was a hoodie, a gray one with a logo I didn't recognize. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. Definitely not mine. And Helen wouldn't be caught dead in something this plain. It didn't smell like perfume or anything feminine, either. It smelled like a guy. Sweat and cheap cologne. Maybe. Curiosity got the better of me. "Hey, Helen," I called out, heading toward the kitchen where I could hear her clinking dishes. She poked her head around the corner, a dish towel in one hand. "What's up?" "This hoodie," I said, holding it up. "It's not mine. Who does it belong to?" Helen's expression didn't even falter. She shrugged, flashing me one of those dismissive smiles. "Oh, that's Carl's. He's been helping out with some of the heavier stuff around the house while you're at work. I probably just threw it in the wash by mistake." "Carl?" I repeated. Carl was the neighbor's kid. Well, not really a kid anymore. He was probably in his mid-20s, muscular, and always looking for odd jobs. I'd seen him mowing lawns and cleaning gutters for folks on the street, but I didn't remember agreeing to him doing chores here. "Since when does Carl help out around the house?" Helen waved me off like it wasn't a big deal. "Oh, I don't know. A few weeks? He's just been helping with stuff like moving furniture, yard work, you know. Figured you'd be too tired after work." Something about the way she said it made my stomach twist. It wasn't the words, really. It was the ease in her voice, like she'd rehearsed this answer. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something felt off. Still, I didn't press it. Maybe I was just being paranoid. "Huh. Okay," I said, tossing the hoodie back into the basket. "I'll take it over to him tomorrow." "Don't worry about it," Helen said quickly, almost too quickly. "I'll give it to him next time I see him." That flicker of unease grew, but I shrugged it off. Helen wasn't the type to lie, and Carl was harmless, right? Just some kid trying to earn a buck. Still, as I sat down with my beer later that night, I couldn't help but notice how distant Helen had been lately. Not in a glaring way, but subtle things. Her phone face down on the counter, her vague answers when I asked how her day went, the way she'd been dressing up more often, even just to run errands. I told myself I was overthinking it. People went through phases. Marriage wasn't supposed to be exciting all the time, right? I had a solid job, a decent house, and a wife who took care of everything while I worked my ass off. What more could I ask for? But as I stared at that laundry basket from across the room, the gray hoodie sticking out like a sore thumb, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. And it was only the beginning. The unease I'd felt about the hoodie didn't go away. If anything, it started growing roots. It wasn't like me to overthink things, but the more I tried to brush it off, the more it nagged at me. And then there was Carl. It didn't take long for me to notice how often he was around. I didn't really think about it until Mrs. Goodwin, our nosy neighbor from across the street, flagged me down one evening as I was pulling into the driveway. "Your wife's keeping Carl busy, huh?" she said with a sly grin. "What do you mean?" I asked, stepping out of the car. The chill in the air seemed sharper somehow. "Oh, I just see his truck here a lot during the day," she said, glancing over her shoulder as if someone might be listening. "Nice boy, that Carl. Always so helpful. I'm sure Helen appreciates it." I forced a polite smile, muttering something about how Carl was a hard worker, but my stomach churned. When I walked into the house, I saw what Mrs. Goodwin meant. Carl's truck was parked right out front, and Helen was wearing jeans and a blouse I hadn't seen her wear in years. The kind that clung a little too snugly for someone just doing chores around the house. Her makeup was light but noticeable, and she smelled faintly of perfume. "Hey, Han," she chirped, a little too cheerfully. "You're home early." I glanced toward the living room, where Carl's toolbox sat open on the floor. He was nowhere to be seen. "Yeah, they let us off a little early today. What's Carl working on?" Helen waved toward the backyard. "He's helping me fix the garden trellis. It's been wobbly for months. I stepped toward the back door and saw him out there, hammering away. He waved at me, all smiles, like nothing was out of the ordinary. I waved back stiffly before turning to Helen. "You've been having him over a lot lately, huh?" She brushed past me, picking up the toolbox like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Well, he's cheap and available. Besides, you're always so busy, Otis. I figured it'd take some of the pressure off you." It sounded reasonable enough, but I couldn't ignore how defensively she said it. I didn't push it. Not yet. Over the next few weeks, Carl's visits became more frequent and my discomfort grew. I started paying closer attention, and the details didn't add up. I'd come home and find things out of place. Carl's work gloves on the kitchen counter, a half-drunk soda can by the couch, or his boots left by the door. Helen had started dressing up more, too. Nothing over the top, but little changes like wearing her hair down, painting her nails, or switching out her usual sweats for fitted jeans and cute tops. And it always seemed to coincide with Carl's work days. When I casually brought it up one night, Helen laughed it off. "Seriously, Otis? You're jealous of Carl? He's a kid. Besides, you know how much I love you. You've got nothing to worry about." Her words should have reassured me, but they didn't. Not when I caught her glancing at her phone more often, smiling at texts she wouldn't share. Not when I started hearing from other neighbors about how Carl seemed to spend more time at my house than his own. One Saturday, I came back from running errands and found Carl's jacket draped over the couch. Helen said he was fixing something in the garage, but when I peeked in there, all I saw was him leaning against the workbench, scrolling through his phone. I didn't say anything at the time. I just nodded and left, but the doubts were getting louder. By the end of that week, I couldn't shake the feeling anymore. There were too many signs, too many little things piling up. It felt like I was standing in quicksand, and the more I tried to ignore it, the deeper I sank. I told myself I'd wait for something concrete before jumping to conclusions. But deep down, I knew. Something was going on between my wife and Carl. I just didn't know how far it had gone, or how much worse it was going to get. Sometimes, fate has a twisted sense of humor. If my supervisor hadn't cut my late shift short that night, I might have stayed blissfully ignorant a little longer. Instead, I walked into a nightmare I couldn't unsee. It was just past 9 p.m. when I pulled into the driveway. The house was dark, except for the faint glow spilling out from the backyard. I thought it was odd. Helen wasn't one to hang out outside at night. I killed the engine and stepped out quietly, noticing Carl's truck parked a few houses down. My heart sank. I moved toward the backyard, the crunch of gravel under my boots feeling unbearably loud. The closer I got, the more I heard. Soft laughter and murmured words I couldn't quite make out. My stomach knotted as I reached the edge of the fence and peered through a gap in the wooden slats. There they were, sitting on the patio bench. Helen leaned in close to Carl, her hand resting on his thigh like it belonged there. He was wearing that damn gray hoodie, the same one I'd found in the laundry weeks ago. And then it happened. She kissed him. Not a quick peck, not some innocent misunderstanding. No, this was intimate. Familiar. Her hands slid up his chest, and he pulled her closer like they'd done this 100 times before. I froze, the world tilting beneath me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. All I could do was stand there, watching my wife and the neighbor's son lock lips in my backyard like it was their own private paradise. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, I stumbled back toward the front yard. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with my keys to get inside. I thought about storming out there, screaming, demanding answers, but something stopped me. Instead, I collapsed onto the couch, staring blankly at the wall. They'd been in my house. How long had this been going on? How many times had he laughed at me behind my back, probably while sitting on my couch, drinking my beer? And Helen, God, Helen. She didn't even look guilty. She didn't act like someone hiding a secret. She looked happy. My mind raced as I tried to piece everything together. The hoodie, the dressing up, the constant excuses about how busy she was with errands. It all fell into place, each memory slicing through me like a blade. The worst part was how deliberate it seemed. The sheer audacity of doing it in our home, in plain sight. I wanted to explode, to rip that smug grin off Carl's face and demand to know why Helen thought he was worth betraying me. but I held back. Something about the way she kissed him, so sure of herself, told me she'd try to twist it if I confronted her. She'd gaslight me, call me paranoid, and make it all my fault. No, I wasn't going to let her off that easy. Not this time. If she wanted to play games, I'd play too, but I was going to win. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning with anger, betrayal, and a growing sense of resolve. By the time the sun came up, I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to confront them yet. First, I needed proof. Cold, undeniable proof that Helen couldn't weasel her way out of. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was war. And I intended to come out of it on top. The following evening, I decided it was time to start testing the waters. I couldn't keep pretending I didn't know what was going on. The rage bubbling inside me needed an outlet, and Helen, my sweet, loyal wife, was about to get her first dose. She was in the kitchen when I walked in, humming to herself like she didn't have a care in the world. It was almost impressive, really, how calm she seemed. Like she wasn't sneaking around behind my back with a guy who was barely old enough to rent a car. I leaned against the counter, watching her for a moment before I spoke. So, I started, my voice deceptively casual. "How's Carl doing these days?" Her hand froze mid-stir, but only for a second. Then she turned to me with that practiced smile of hers. "Oh, you know, same as always. Busy helping people out. Helping people out. Right." I folded my arms, meeting her gaze. "He sure spends a lot of time here. Almost feels like he's part of the family." Helen let out a short laugh, but there was an edge to it. "Don't be ridiculous, Otis. He's just a kid trying to make some extra cash. I thought you appreciated not having to deal with all the housework." "Sure," I said, nodding slowly. "It's great. Really great. Especially when he's doing all that housework in the backyard with you. Looked like hard labor from where I was standing." That did it. Her smile faltered, and for a split second, I saw panic flash in her eyes. But Helen, ever the master manipulator, quickly recovered. "What are you talking about?" she said, her voice tight. "Have you been spying on me?" "Spying?" I repeated, laughing bitterly. "That's rich. You know, I don't think I need to spy when my wife is making out with the neighbor's kid in plain sight." Helen crossed her arms, her expression shifting from nervous to defensive. "Oh, come on, Otis. You're blowing this way out of proportion. It was just a kiss. It didn't mean anything." "Just a kiss?" I shot back, my voice rising. "You call sneaking around with Carl nothing? While I'm busting my ass at work to keep this house running." She rolled her eyes, and that's when the mask came off. "You're so predictable, Otis. Always playing the victim. Maybe if you weren't so boring all the time, I wouldn't have to find excitement elsewhere." For a moment, I was too stunned to speak. Boring? That's what she was going with? "You're seriously blaming me for this?" I said, my voice cold now. "For you sneaking around with some punk who probably still lives with his parents?" "Don't act like you're perfect," she snapped. "You're always working late, always tired. Do you even remember the last time we had sex? Carl makes me feel alive, Otis. Something you haven't done in years." The words hit me like a sledgehammer, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "You know what, Helen?" I said, my voice calm despite the fire burning inside me. "You're right. I have been predictable, but that's about to change." Her smirk faded as I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there. I didn't need to yell or throw things to prove my point. The real confrontation wasn't over yet, but I was done playing her game on her terms. If Helen thought she could keep manipulating me, she was in for a rude awakening. I was done being the boring, predictable husband. Now, it was my turn to take control, and I wasn't going to hold back. After that confrontation, something inside me shifted. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was determined. Helen had made her choice, and now it was my turn to make mine. If she thought she could waltz through life unscathed after this, she was in for a hell of a surprise. I started by gathering evidence. I wasn't going to give her a chance to weasel out of this or spin the story to make me look like the bad guy. I needed proof, clear, undeniable proof of her betrayal. The first step was setting up cameras. I installed a few discreet ones around the house, one in the living room, another in the backyard, and one in the kitchen. They were small and easy to hide, tucked into corners where Helen wouldn't notice them. If she wanted to keep sneaking around with Carl, I'd catch her in the act. Next, I started recording our conversations. My phone became my closest ally, always ready to capture her lies and manipulations. I didn't trust her words anymore, and every excuse she gave was just more ammunition for me to use later. The real goldmine, though, was Carl. That idiot practically left a trail of evidence everywhere he went. His hoodie, his tools, his half-empty energy drinks. It was all piling up, screaming their guilt. I started keeping a log of everything: dates, times, what I saw, and what I suspected. It wasn't enough to just confront Helen again. No, I wanted to expose her in a way she couldn't recover from. During all this, I reached out to my best friend, Ethan. If there was anyone who could help me stay sane through this mess, it was him. Ethan had been my rock since high school, a no-nonsense kind of guy who always told it like it was. When I told him what was happening, he didn't sugarcoat it. "Man, that's brutal," he said, leaning back in his chair as we sat in his garage one night. "But you can't let her get away with this. You've got to think smart. Don't let your anger screw you over." "I'm way past anger," I muttered, swirling the beer in my hand. "This is about making sure she doesn't walk out of this with a shred of dignity left." Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening. "Good. But don't lose sight of the bigger picture. This is your life we're talking about, Otis. Play it right, and you'll come out of this stronger." His words stuck with me. As tempting as it was to blow everything up right then and there, I knew I had to be strategic. Helen wasn't just some random cheater. She was manipulative, calculating. If I wasn't careful, she'd find a way to turn this all around on me. The tipping point came a week later when I caught Helen sneaking a text to Carl while we were watching TV. She thought I wasn't paying attention, but I saw the way her lips twitched into a little smile, her fingers tapping away like she couldn't wait to talk to him. That was the final straw. I waited until she went to bed and then grabbed her phone from the counter. She'd gotten lazy with her password, same code she'd used for years. Within seconds, I was in. The texts were worse than I expected. There wasn't just flirting. There were plans, detailed conversations about when they could meet up, how much Helen hated being trapped in a dull marriage, and even digs about me. "He's so clueless," one of her texts read. "He thinks I'm just stressed out. Poor guy." Another from Carl: "Don't worry, babe. We'll figure something out. You deserve better than that, loser." I snapped photos of everything, my hands shaking with a mix of fury and vindication. Helen and Carl weren't just playing games. They were making me the punchline. By the end of that night, I had everything I needed. The camera footage, the texts, the logs, it was all there. But I wasn't going to stop at just confronting her. I wanted everyone to know the truth. My first move was sending the evidence to Carl's parents. I'd always had a decent relationship with them. They were kind, hardworking people who didn't deserve to have a son like him. I figured they'd be horrified when they saw what their golden boy had been up to. Then I started making a list of neighbors who needed to know. Mrs. Goodwin would eat this up, and once she started talking, the news would spread like wildfire. Helen and Carl wouldn't be able to set foot in the neighborhood without everyone knowing exactly what they'd done. The last piece of the puzzle was Helen herself. I wasn't just going to throw her out. I was going to make sure she knew exactly how badly she'd screwed up. By the time I finally went to bed that night, I felt something I hadn't in weeks: control. Helen thought she was playing me, but she had no idea what was coming. This was my house, my life, and my rules, and I wasn't about to let her take any of it from me without a fight. It all came together faster than I expected. Once I had the evidence in hand, it was like I couldn't stop myself from setting the plan into motion. Helen and Carl thought they were untouchable, but they underestimated just how far I was willing to go to make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of people they were. The first step was sending the evidence to Carl's parents. I waited until Helen left for one of her errands before I composed the email. I attached the video of them kissing in the backyard, along with screenshots of their texts. The message was short and to the point. Asterisk Mr. and Mrs. Porter, I'm sorry you have to see this, but I thought you deserved to know what your son has been doing in my house with my wife. I've always respected you, and I hope you'll handle this situation however you see fit. Otis asterisk. I hit send and sat back, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and dread. Carl's parents were decent folks. I couldn't imagine how they'd react to this, but one thing was certain, they wouldn't just let it slide. Next, I reached out to a few key neighbors. Mrs. Goodwin was at the top of the list, naturally. She'd been the one to clue me in on Carl's frequent visits, and I knew she'd love the chance to, accidentally, let the story slip during her morning coffee group. I didn't send her everything, just enough to make sure she got the picture. By the end of the day, I started noticing the shift. Mrs. Goodwin gave me a knowing nod when I stepped out to grab the mail. Mr. Abernathy from down the street shot me a sympathetic look when I drove past. The whispers had begun, and I knew it was only a matter of time before Helen and Carl became the talk of the neighborhood. The real fallout started when Carl's parents showed up at my house that evening. I wasn't expecting them so soon, but there they were, standing on my porch with matching expressions of shame and fury. "Otis," Mr. Porter said, his voice tight. "Can we talk?" I stepped aside, letting them in. Mrs. Porter clutched her purse like it was the only thing holding her together. "We had no idea," she said, her voice trembling. "We're so sorry, Otis. We're horrified." I nodded, trying to hide the bitterness in my tone. "I figured you'd want to know. I'm sorry to have to drag you into this." "We'll handle it," Mr. Porter said firmly. "He's coming home tonight, and we'll make sure he understands just how badly he screwed up. You have our word." I believed them. Carl might have been a manipulative little punk, but his parents weren't the type to let this slide. That was one less problem for me to deal with. By the next morning, the gossip mill was in full swing. Helen had no idea what was happening until she went out for groceries and came back looking pale and rattled. I was sitting on the couch when she stormed in, slamming the door behind her. "What the hell did you do?" she snapped, her voice shrill. I raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb, Otis. People are staring at me, whispering. Even the cashier at the store wouldn't look me in the eye." I shrugged. "Maybe they've heard about your little hobby with Carl." Her face turned crimson, and for a moment, she looked like she might explode. But then, just like always, she switched tactics. "You're pathetic," she spat. "What kind of man does that?" "The kind of man who's done being made a fool of," I said, standing up to face her. "You've been lying to me, cheating on me, and acting like I'm the problem. Well, guess what, Helen? Everyone knows the truth now. You don't get to hide anymore." She opened her mouth to fire back, but no words came out. Instead, she turned and stormed upstairs, slamming the bedroom door behind her. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I'd won a round. That evening, Carl's parents came back, this time with Carl in tow. I didn't even have to open the door to hear the shouting. Mr. Porter's voice boomed across the street as he tore into his son, and Carl didn't seem to have much to say in his defense. I stayed inside, watching through the window as they loaded Carl into the car and drove off. The neighbors were peeking out from behind curtains and across fences, no doubt adding more fuel to the fire. Carl had officially become a pariah, and Helen wasn't far behind him. I went to bed that night feeling lighter than I had in months. The neighborhood knew. Carl's parents knew. Helen knew she was backed into a corner. This was just the beginning, but for the first time, I felt like I was in control of the story. Helen wanted excitement? Well, she was about to get more than she bargained for. The next morning, I woke up with a clear plan in mind. Helen wasn't just going to walk away from this with a shrug and an apology. I was done being the guy she walked all over. If she thought I was predictable, it was time to show her just how wrong she was. Helen came downstairs around noon, wearing one of her usual casual outfits. For the first time in a while, her face wasn't plastered with the smug confidence I'd grown used to. She looked nervous. Good. I was sitting at the kitchen table, my laptop open, surrounded by stacks of documents, bank statements, emails, screenshots, you name it. She hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, eyeing the scene like she wasn't sure if she wanted to approach me. "Morning," she said cautiously. I didn't look up. "Afternoon," I replied curtly, keeping my focus on the screen. She lingered by the counter, fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. "We need to talk," she said finally. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. Yeah, we do. Sit down. Her eyes widened slightly, probably not expecting me to take the lead. She pulled out a chair and sat across from me, her posture stiff. I'm sorry, she started, her voice low. I know I've made mistakes. Mistakes? I interrupted, my tone icy. Helen, a mistake is forgetting to pick up milk at the store. Sneaking around with the neighbor's kid for weeks, maybe months, isn't a mistake. That's a choice. A deliberate, selfish choice. She flinched but quickly recovered. I wasn't happy, Otis. You have no idea how lonely I've been. You're always working, always tired. I didn't mean for it to happen, but Carl, he listened to me. He made me feel wanted. Wanted? I said, laughing bitterly. You mean he made you feel young? Exciting. Like you weren't tied down to the boring old guy who actually gives a damn about this house and this marriage. She started to speak, but I held up a hand. No, you don't get to talk your way out of this. I've spent weeks piecing together your lies, watching you sneak around, and listening to you blame me for your bad decisions. I'm done. Helen's expression shifted from regretful to angry. You're blowing this out of proportion. People cheat all the time, Otis. It doesn't mean I don't love you. Don't love me? I said, my voice rising. Helen, love isn't kissing Carl in my backyard. Love isn't texting him behind my back and laughing about how clueless I am. Love isn't betraying the person who's been by your side for years. So don't sit here and insult me with that crap. She glared at me, crossing her arms. Fine. What do you want then? A divorce? Is that it? Exactly, I said, standing up. But first, you're getting the hell out of this house. Helen's jaw dropped, and for once, she didn't have a comeback. I walked over to the door and grabbed a duffel bag I'd packed with her essentials, clothes, toiletries, the basics. I tossed it on the floor in front of her. You can pick up the rest of your stuff later, I said coldly. But as of now, you're not welcome here anymore. The locks are already being changed this afternoon. You can't do this, she hissed, standing up. This is my house too. Not anymore, I shot back. I've got more than enough evidence of your infidelity to make sure you don't see a dime in court. You wanted excitement, Helen? Well, I hope it was worth it. She looked at me like she wanted to say something, probably some last-ditch attempt to manipulate me, but I wasn't having it. Get out, I said firmly. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. For the first time in weeks, the house felt like mine again. I spent the rest of the afternoon packing up her things and leaving them on the porch. By the time the locksmith arrived, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Helen could try to spin this however she wanted, but I wasn't going to let her lies control my life anymore. That night, I sat on the couch, a beer in hand, and watched as the neighborhood lights dimmed one by one. I thought about the years I'd spent with Helen, the good times that felt like a distant memory now. She'd thrown it all away for a fling with Carl, and for what? I didn't have all the answers yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I was finally free. Throwing Helen out of the house was only the beginning. As far as I was concerned, Carl still had to face the consequences of his role in this mess. The kid thought he could sneak around with my wife, disrespect me in my own home, and walk away unscathed. Not on my watch. The day after Helen left, Carl's parents paid me another visit. This time, they didn't bring Carl with them. Mr. Porter looked angrier than I'd ever seen him, and Mrs. Porter's face was streaked with tears. Otis, Mr. Porter said as soon as I opened the door. I don't even know what to say. I thought we raised him better than this. He's got a lot of nerve, that's for sure, I replied, stepping aside to let them in. We've told him he's not welcome in our house until he takes responsibility for what he's done, Mrs. Porter said, her voice trembling. But he doesn't seem to care. That didn't surprise me. Carl always struck me as the type who thought he was untouchable. I poured them both a cup of coffee and sat down at the table. Look, I appreciate you coming over, but what happens with Carl is ultimately up to you. I've got my own mess to clean up. Mr. Porter nodded, his jaw clenched. I just wanted to let you know we're cutting him off financially. No more free rides. He's on his own now. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. Carl might have thought he was some hotshot, but without his parents footing the bill, he'd be scrambling like the rest of us. Later that afternoon, I spotted Carl walking down the street, his head hanging low. It looked like he'd finally realized how bad he'd screwed up. He didn't even glance toward my house as he passed, but I couldn't resist stepping outside. "Hey, Carl," I called out, leaning against the porch railing. He stopped in his tracks, his shoulders stiffening. Slowly, he turned to face me, his expression a mix of guilt and defiance. "What do you want?" he muttered. I smirked. "Just wanted to let you know that everyone around here knows exactly what kind of guy you are. You think you're a big man, sneaking around with a married woman? Pathetic." Carl's face flushed red, but he didn't say anything. I could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to come up with a response, but I didn't give him the chance. "You thought you could play me for a fool, didn't you? Well, let me tell you something, kid. You're out of your depth. Your parents are done with you. The neighbors won't even look at you. And as far as I'm concerned, you don't exist." His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might take a swing at me. But instead, he turned and walked away, his fists clenched at his sides. I watched him go, feeling a surge of satisfaction. That evening, I heard through the grapevine that Carl's parents had officially kicked him out. Apparently, he'd been staying with a friend, but even that arrangement didn't last long. Word spread fast in our neighborhood, and nobody wanted to be associated with him. He'd burned every bridge he had. I'll admit, part of me felt a twinge of pity for him. Carl was young, and it was clear he didn't understand the gravity of his actions. But that pity was fleeting. He'd made his choices, and now he had to live with the consequences. As for Helen, I heard through mutual acquaintances that she was staying with a distant relative a few towns over. She'd been trying to contact me, texting, calling, even leaving voicemails. But I didn't respond. I had nothing left to say to her. The neighborhood gossip eventually settled down, but the damage had been done. Carl was a pariah, Helen was out of my life, and I was finally starting to see a path forward. It wasn't easy, but knowing that they were both facing the consequences of their actions made it a little easier to breathe. That night, as I sat on the porch with a drink in hand, I thought about everything that had happened. Carl's downfall wasn't just about revenge. It was about taking back control of my life. I'd spent too long being the guy who let things slide, the guy who avoided conflict to keep the peace. Not anymore. This was my turning point, and I wasn't looking back. With Helen and Carl out of my life, I finally had the space to reflect on everything that had happened. The betrayal, the lies, the humiliation. It was a storm I never saw coming, but I wasn't going to let it define me. I'd made it through the worst, and now it was time to rebuild. I started by focusing on myself. For too long, I'd put all my energy into work and the house, thinking that was enough to keep my marriage afloat. But now I realized I'd been neglecting my own well-being. So, I dusted off my gym membership card and started going a few nights a week. It felt good to sweat out the frustration, to push my limits, and to remind myself that I was still capable of growth. My friend Ethan became my unofficial therapist. We'd meet up a few times a week, sometimes for drinks, sometimes just to sit in his garage and shoot the breeze. He was blunt as ever, but his advice was exactly what I needed. "You dodged a bullet," he said one night, sipping his beer. "Helen was deadweight, man. You're better off without her." "Yeah, but it doesn't make it hurt any less," I admitted. "I still think about the good times, you know? Like, were they all a lie?" Ethan shook his head. "Nah, they weren't a lie. But people change, Otis. And sometimes, the person they change into isn't someone you want to keep around. It sucks, but you've got to focus on the next chapter." With Ethan's help, I started reconnecting with people I'd lost touch with during my marriage. Old friends, family members. I reached out to them one by one, apologizing for my absence and explaining what had happened. Most of them were shocked by the story, but they were supportive. It felt like I was rebuilding my foundation, one relationship at a time. Even my sister, Margaret, stepped up in ways I didn't expect. She'd always been a bit of a skeptic about Helen, though she'd never said it outright. Now, she made it her mission to check in on me regularly, bringing over home-cooked meals and dragging me out to social events. "Come on," she said one Friday night, holding up a couple of tickets to a local concert. You need to get out of this house. It's starting to smell like loneliness and takeout. I laughed, but she wasn't wrong. I agreed to go, and for the first time in months, I actually felt like myself again. One of the biggest steps in moving on was dealing with the house. Everywhere I turned, I saw memories of Helen, both good and bad. The backyard where she kissed Carl, the kitchen where we'd argued, the bedroom where we used to laugh and dream together. I couldn't live with those ghosts anymore. I called a real estate agent and started the process of putting the house on the market. It wasn't easy. This had been my home for years. But I knew I couldn't truly move on while I was surrounded by reminders of what I'd lost. As I packed up boxes and sorted through old photos, I found myself smiling at the good memories. They didn't hurt as much anymore. They were a part of my past, but they didn't have to control my future. By the time the house sold, I'd already found a new place in a different part of town. It wasn't as big or as polished, but it was mine. A fresh start in every sense of the word. I spent the first night there sitting on the floor with a pizza box and a beer, feeling a strange mix of sadness and hope. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my own life. No lies, no betrayal, just me, rebuilding from the ground up. As I settled into my new routine, I started to notice the little things that made life better. I had more energy, more confidence. People seemed to notice it too, smiling more, striking up conversations. It was like the weight of Helen's betrayal had been lifted, and I was finally free to be myself again. Moving on wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And with every step I took, I felt a little closer to the man I wanted to be. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories on the channel.